It is a beautiful day to be alive, and I am so excited that we have this time together. I'm Sana Laybourne, she, her. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from across the world who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So go ahead and grab your cup of coffee and get ready for an engaging and insightful conversation. Memphis goes by many names: home of the blues, BBQ Capital, and the Bluff City. The last one is a reference to our location on the bluffs of the mighty Mississippi River. In fact, it is our prime location on the river that allowed Memphis to flourish throughout our city's history as a transportation hub, a legacy that continues to serve our city in the present day. For Memphians, the Mississippi River is many things. It's part of the beautiful downtown scenery, along with the new bridge and the pyramid, aka the Bass Pro Shop. And in 2022, when the river reached record lows as a result of intense drought that affected about 85% of the country, it also became a site for a scavenger hunt, revealing many hidden treasures. Over a decade ago, in 2010, intense rainfall led to flooding in nearby Millington, Tennessee. And then the next year, the Mississippi River flooded, again impacting Millington. So the river is a place of beauty, of discovery, but also of destruction. And these are just a few recent snapshots of the power of the Mississippi River. There is so much more to tell over its very long history. And to delve into just a slice of that story today, I'm joined by Boyce Upholt. Boyce Upholt is a nature critic whose writing probes the relationship between humans and the rest of the natural world, especially in the U.S. South. He holds a bachelor's degree from Haverford College and an MFA from the program for writers at Warren Wilson College. He moved to the Mississippi Delta in 2009, where he discovered an unexpected wilderness amid an agricultural empire, the Mississippi River, which for hundreds of miles offers a corridor of islands and sandbars and wetland forests with no settlement or development. Boyce's work has been published in The Atlantic, National Geographic, the Oxford American, and Virginia Quarterly Review, among other publications. And in 2019, he was awarded the James Beard Award for Investigative Journalism. His stories have been noted in the Best American Science and Nature and Best American Non-Required Reading series. Boyce is the author of The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. And Boyce joins us today. Boyce, hello. So glad to have you here.
Hello, Sana. I'm so glad to be here.
I am so excited about your book. When I saw the title, I was immediately drawn in, especially because as someone who's grown up in Memphis and the Mississippi River has been a backdrop quite literally for my life. And for many of my experiences in childhood, I was like, ooh, I wonder what, like tell me more, right? Sometimes we can take for granted what's in our back door, in our backyard. And so I was so excited to delve into this book that really tells the history of the Mississippi River. Again, something that maybe we kind of take for granted.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that take for granted, that idea of the backyardness is maybe part of what led me into this as someone who did not grow up at all anywhere near the Mississippi River. I grew up in suburban Connecticut, and I don't think I thought about the Mississippi River much at all growing up. Surely it was discussed in high school history in some form, but I no memory of what they told me. So I kind of stumbled into the South 15 years ago, into the Mississippi Delta, basically because I knew I wanted to be a writer, didn't know how to do it, and going somewhere exotic felt like a good way to get started. And as a Connecticut kid, the Mississippi Delta felt pretty exotic, and eventually stumbled my way into the Mississippi River. And I think in some ways, because it was not my backyard, I was not that the local, like my friends that had lived there their whole lives weren't fascinated by the river, but perhaps there was something useful about bringing fresh eyes to it and saying like, wait a minute, there's this super wild river that runs behind all this farmland, and we're not going there. We're not talking about it. What's up with that? So
Yeah, I love that idea. Exactly what you said, fresh eyes, right? We can take it for granted, but you come down to the Mississippi Delta and it's something new and exciting, and you have questions about it in a way that folks, again, who it's like, oh, yeah, it's the river, like kind of so what? You're able to actually bring that curiosity to it. And I think it really shows up in this book because let me tell you, I was reading the book. You have all this great history, and history, for folks who don't know, is very spicy. That's what I like to say. It's spicy. When I tell you I was writing some notes in the margin because there are some petty moments in there, there are some controversies in there. And so for folks who are like, okay, what is this book about? Like, what am I really going to learn about the Mississippi River? Let me tell you, there is so much in here. It was very juicy. So I think that's also a credit to you thinking about you as a writer and the story you want to tell, and also the way that you've presented it, which for me gave me so much more character to this body of water.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that because I think one of the challenges was I don't know, like there I got 4,000 years of history here, right? And in some way, like, and any reader that picks it up will realize I'm obsessed with the lower Mississippi River down here, where all these tributaries come together. But the Mississippi is this sprawling thing. And I think of the Ohio and the Missouri as part of it. So there's so much to cover that the only real character in some ways was the river. And I was kind of like, I could, Thomas Jefferson is in here and all these engineers are in here and I try and treat them as characters. They are characters, but I also didn't want it to be like a tale of the engineer, like the big important white guys who like fiddled with this river. That's not the book I wanted to write. And so I kind of had to find as much juicy, spicy stuff as I could in history and in particular stuff that could make the Mississippi hundreds of years ago, make it feel real. Like, what did it look and feel like, taste like to people even sometimes? And tried to pack as much as that into the book as I could so that I could take all this history and through it, keep the river there. It's just like physical presence that people could picture and feel in their minds.
Yeah, I love that idea of keeping like the river as as the character, right? As the figure, the central story that you want to tell, because there's so many different directions that this story could have gone. And so I'm wondering for you, thinking about like your personal experience with kind of having this curiosity and fresh eyes with the river, how much of that were you able, or how much did that influence what ended up in the book, the stories that you decided to tell, or even the direction that you wanted to take this story?
I mean, definitely a lot. I was just talking to a friend about it this morning about like what's in it and what's not. One of the ideas in the book is that the river is, we think of a river as like the blue line on a map. And
Mm.
there's a lot more to any river than that, in particular Mississippi. And so to me, the floodplain, so the area that only gets flooded part of the year, is intimately part of the river. The river would not be itself without it. And then even the Mississippi Delta, where I used to live, it like used to be the floodplain and is not anymore because of the levee, but that is also part of the river. I don't know. I mean, I think if I hadn't lived in the Delta for 6 years before starting this book, if I had come to this book because I just like canoed down the whole river, it might have looked really different. And I think it would have been a lesser book for not including all of those complexities. So that's part of it. But honestly, like the core of the book, the middle section is this fairly linear, which is unusual for me to proceed chronologically, but I tried to keep the middle chronological, kind of talking about 200 years of American engineers, what they did to the river. And in some way, I think that part came out well. I've gotten a lot of compliments on it, but it was what I was least interested in writing about initially because it was not at all my experience out in the river, but it was stuff I had. It's like, well, this is what made what I see now. So I'm going to have to get through it all.
Mm, I love that. Thanks so much for sharing that. Because, one thing that I really took away from the book was how much people's, personal relationship with the river, their beliefs, their worldview, their values impacted how they treated the river. So you talk about different communities or cultures that lived alongside the river or with the river almost. And then you talk about all these different contractors or elected officials or presidents or whomever who had a very different approach to how they saw the river and what they wanted to do to it, not necessarily with it, but what how they wanted to change it or
Right.
control it. And so that's why I was curious, for you and your own relationship, with this river, how did that then show up in, again, the story that you wanted to craft and tell?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it also was helpful that I mean, that this to versus with divide, it makes a lot of sense in that I first found the river because I went canoeing on it. I was getting started as a writer, and there was a very famous, people in Memphis may know of him, John Ruskey. He's like legendary figure. If you're going to go canoeing on the lower Mississippi River, he's your guy. And so I convinced a magazine to let me it's like, it's kind of crazy, right? To take tourists out on this big, maritime highway. What's up with that? Let me go canoe with this guy at sea. And so that I was doing something with the Mississippi River from the beginning, like getting out and like I could trail my hand in the water out of the canoe. And so that's always been my primary relationship. Yeah, like over through the book was also a project of understanding other people's relationship, people who fish, even people who are like towboats. I have had issues with the navigation industry at large, but I still think like I have a lot of respect for and friends in the navigation industry, talk to people who work on towboats, and they have their own very different experience of the river. They are spend days on it without even being able to get down and touch the water and never going into port. And like that point of view is fascinating to me as well.
Mhm. I loved all these different perspectives of the river. And even just as you mentioned, like, how do we experience it? For some of us, maybe it's recreation, right? We're canoeing or paddle boating or something like that. Or for other folks, it is like their place of employment or it is their home, right? Where generations of their families have grown up. And so as I was reading the book, as again, a Memphian, I'm always looking for, okay, I know the Mississippi River is right there. Where does Memphis pop up? And of course it does, right? It would kind of has to.
Yep.
But I was also really curious because, when I think about my relationship to the Mississippi River, something that is a very, salient childhood memory is going to Mud Island. And so for Memphians who are familiar with Mud Island, and then we have a replica of like the lower Mississippi at Mud Island. And I was really curious because you didn't mention like that model of the lower Mississippi. And I just knew it was going to be in there. And so I'm wondering, your thoughts on that. And then you also do talk about another really big model of of part of the Mississippi. And maybe we can get into talking about that as well.
Yeah. So I love models of the Mississippi River. I love Mud Island. I've met a couple afternoons out there walking around, and it's such a cool space. And I love the way the sort of the terrain is inscribed into the concrete. It's beautiful. And I mean, there were so many models that I couldn't fit in here. Right, there's another really cool one down in Baton Rouge at LSU that is actually used for researching how engineering solutions might impact the coast. And then there's one in Boston, I think, that used for similar purposes. The model that I talked about in the river, like I basically had to decide, okay, I probably can only get one model in this book. And the model I chose was, I think, both the first one I saw, and I think in some ways the most influential. So the Army Corps of Engineers is the agency, the federal agency that has done all the work on the Mississippi River since 1824, so 200 years now. And their process of engineering the river was kind of like fits and stages. I think it was rather haphazard. They kind of like do this for a while and do that. And then in the 1940s, they got this grand idea of like, wow, we've done so much. We should really try and wrap our head around how it all works together. And this was, just before computers were coming along. So like the way to do that is to build a model where we can kind of like test how things flow throughout the system. And so they built this thing in the hills outside of Jackson, Mississippi. It is, I don't remember the acreage, but it's larger than Disneyland. And it includes kind of the river from Louisiana up to Illinois, and then parts of the Ohio, the upper Mississippi, the Missouri. It's a vast thing. And it's now a feral wasteland sort of. It never became very useful. It was so hard to build that they built it too slowly. By the time they were done, it was replaced by computers. And so now it's part of a park that's owned by the city of Jackson. And they kind of put a fence up, but they don't really try that hard to keep people out. And you can kind of slip through the fence and walk through this strange wasteland model thing. And so there's something about, Mud Island's great, but it's almost more polite than this model down in Jackson where you feel like you're in this weird wilderness with a map on the ground. So
Yeah, I was really amazed by this desire to try to map out the Mississippi River. And as a reader, of course, I am able to kind of have this at arm's length, right? Because I'm like, oh, that's not going to work, right? So to try to create a model of a river that is ever changing, which is what you illustrate throughout the book, how much the river has changed over its long history. But even in the short history of the United States, kind of as we think about it, the river has changed so much. So when you're talking about, the Army Corps of Engineers wants to create this model in order to figure out, okay, how can we manipulate the river to make it maybe slow down or speed up or to be a benefit to certain industries? I was like, oh no, like this is probably not going to end well. And as you mentioned, they're creating this model and it kind of gets outdated rather quickly. And then we do have computers and we're able to do modeling in a lot of different ways. And so I think it's just another really interesting part of history. And, for folks who are listening, what I hear is that if you wanted to go and see this model, this wasteland, you could probably do it. As long as you don't feel, like those fences are meant to keep you out.
Well, there's big holes in them, so they're not gonna keep you. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. No one has ever cared, and there's actual active efforts to restore it and make it truly accessible, which I'm conflicted about because I kind of like it deserves to be preserved as a historic place, but part of the coolness of it to me is the weird feral state of things.
Yes, I was, again, I was like, wow, I was just really amazed at how much I learned about kind of almost my own personal history and our city's history because you have to understand for Memphians, like the river is a big, obviously a big part of how we think about ourselves, but also as a student, I was thinking as I was reading your book, it made me think about like Reelfoot Lake, which is a state park in kind of like the northwestern corner of Tennessee. So again, like a field trip that I took as a kid, or even thinking about when you talk about some of the earthworks located near the river, it made me think about like Chucalissa Indian Village, as it was called when I was growing up. And like we would go there to learn about kind of this different culture and this archaeology of like what are these, what I was always told were burial mounds, right? Which may or may not be true. And so it was also just really a joy to read this book and help me even understand some of the things that I was experiencing growing up. And so I think that's always the mark of a really great book is how it makes us question kind of ourselves and in our own stories, right? That we tell about our personal history or like our community's history.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm glad to hear that it sort of made you rethink things, made you connect the dots. For me, I mean, it's funny that I wrote this book. I took like history. I was like a very nerdy student. I like took all the classes I could, but like the one thing I never did AP in high school was history. Took zero history classes in college. And so this book was my education in American history in a lot of ways. And it was really fun for me to all these like little bits and pieces of history that I like had learned in snippets and other things. Like the river became, I mean, it's like literally a line, but a line through history that I could begin to place so much of what our nation's been through. So
Yeah, I love all those pieces of history because I often like to say, like, the past is always present, but we just
yep.
might not be aware of how it's present and how it's shaping even the choices that we have today. And I love that you talk towards the end of the book about kind of present day, some different, choices that people are making, some different organizing people are doing to, make changes to the river, to expand upon what has already been created. And so that was also really fun for me because our relationship with the river will continue, right? For very much into the future. And so that also gave me a sense of, okay, like we're part of this like living history of the
Yeah.
river. And even the choices that we make will shape, what the river ends up becoming, decades from now, or even maybe a few years, like even closer into the future as well.
Yeah. I mean, we've always been part of the river too, is one of the things that fascinates me, right? It's like, it's probably true in Memphis too. It's definitely true down in Louisiana where I live now. It's like the youngest land on the continent, and there have been people on that coastline since before the land was there. And so the marshes in Louisiana are so beautiful and so wild, but like the standard, I often you talked earlier about how I'm a nature critic, and one of the things I'm critical of the idea of how we think about nature as being this thing that is separate from us.
Mhm.
And so in Louisiana, it's kind of always people have always been out there fishing in those swamps, and then again, the river around Memphis, like the land as we know it now is all 10,000 years ish old, based at the end of the last ice ages. And again, there were people in this territory since then. And so, yeah, we've always been shaping this river. We've shaped it in weird and not always great ways over the past couple centuries. And yeah, we're gonna, have to make decisions about what river we want to see in the future.
Yeah, I love that idea of how, we've shaped the river because, of course, as you mentioned, in kind of like that middle section of the book, you're talking about all these different choices that engineers were making for a variety of different reasons. And I have to be honest, one of my favorite chapters was chapter 6, because you get into a lot of kind of like what I think about as some of the central figures that were making decisions that continue to impact us even today, particularly when we think about like the different levees and the different like engineering that was happening. And so for folks, when I said there's like a lot of pettiness and feuding flooding and drama in this history of the river. I'm particularly thinking about some of the people that you introduce us to in chapter 6, and I'm wondering, not to give too much away, but just a little snippet, because I was really drawn into Andrew Atkinson Humphreys, who kind
Hmm.
of shows up a lot in this chapter. Humphreys is a graduate of West Point, and then he eventually is able to work for the Corps of Engineers. And then he has some feuding and drama with a couple other folks as they're trying to figure out or come to understand the Mississippi River, the flooding, and try to make some decisions about how they could stop it. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about maybe Humphreys, but even the Corps of Engineers, because I think folks don't understand like how they even got involved or that they're involved at all, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Humphreys is sort of like the epitome of the worst of the Corps of Engineers, and he is like, yeah, the central repository of most Mississippi River pettiness, I think. But the Army Corps, I mean, basically it was goes back to the American Revolution, and we were a very frontier settler society back then, and didn't have a lot of people that knew how to build forts or bridges or things like that. And Washington was like, oh, it might be kind of important if we could make some bridges. So they had to bring in some French experts to train, these like English colonial settlers. So that was the origins. It kind of petered out for a little bit, and then Jefferson brought it back because he was really devoted to that kind of like scholarly learning. And then in 1824, a Supreme Court decision kind of declared that rivers were federal property. And at that point, that meant, well, we probably need some federal agency to oversee them. We kind of look around and like, well, the most likely candidates are these engineer guys over here. That's how they became in control of the river. And pretty quickly after 1824, they were out surveying the river to make maps and installing, like making the first small changes to make the river safer for steamboats. And so Humphreys comes along not that long after that. He graduates from West Point. West Point, like the Corps at this point, the Army Corps is seen as these sort of like fussy, elite, rich kids. And Humphreys was very much that. He came
Yes.
from a lot of wealth. Um, and he struggled for a while, but was so ambitious, and it kind of eventually he wrote this massive report. The Congress was like, oh, there's so much flooding happening, we need to figure out what's going on. And he managed to get that assignment, and he worked so hard at it that he had to like go to the hospital and cut off his work on it. And then this is where some of his pettiness first emerges, because because the Army Corps was seen as so fussy and elitist, people didn't really like them. And so Congress also gave money to another engineer, sort of a private consultant, to do his report. And he did it very quickly. And it was just like very intuitively, this beautiful theoretical document that was kind of like, levees, if you build them, they're going to trap the water, and you're going to think you're safe on one side, but if the levee ever fails, you're not. So it's kind of moral hazard sort of thing here, which, not to spoil too much, that's a pretty smart way of looking at it. But Humphreys is struggling. He finally recovers from his illness, and he puts out his massive like 600 page report. And because of his pettiness, he has to say like, well, that other guy said that levees weren't a good idea, but that means I'm gonna have to find a way to say levees are a good idea, even though if you really read it carefully, it's kind of like, well, you here that there's some problems, but you're just like, well, it's cheapest and it's the only thing we can do. And so, yeah, that's kind of the beginnings of how we ended up with levees up and down the Mississippi River. He then got in another fight with a guy named James Buchanan Eads, who's this fascinating character all his own. He would walk on the bottom of the Mississippi River in sort of a diving bell that he made himself. It's very like steampunk. So yeah, again, this was the section of the book that I was least enthusiastic about writing, but then as I got in, there were so many of these like fascinating human stories to get into.
Yeah, I mean, I was really enthralled in this chapter because the drama, the pettiness, and I think you do a
Yes.
great job of bringing these characters to life and their very human motivations, right, for the decisions that they end up, putting forward and kind of championing. And I think that's important to note because for me, as I'm reading the book, again, throughout the history, there are these individual folks who, for a variety of very personal reasons, right, want to make various recommendations or various decisions about what should be done, whether it's levees or floodplains or trying to create more farmland or just all of these different decisions. And I think about like, wow, these kind of decisions that were made maybe by like one kind of champion, or one charismatic person really had impacts on millions of people, right? And so that
Yeah.
also stood out to me.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I was saying before, like I was reluctant to make this a book just about these white engineers and even the pettiness. I mean, I think I make this clear in the book of like Eads and Humphreys, these two, right? The private engineer, the civilian engineer, and the army engineer. They're in such a war. But in my point of view, from this more like 1,000 mile, like bird's eye view, looking at the river over so much history, I'm like, they had very real differences about what they wanted to do to the river, particularly in Louisiana, of like, well, how do we make sure ocean going boats can come in and out? But it's kind of in a certain scale, it's a kind of small question. And they both agreed that like they each thought that they had studied the river so much that they knew everything there was to know about the river and that they could tame the river. So they like philosophically they landed in the same place, which is that the river is knowable and tameable. And so in some ways I think of like, yeah, these decisions that these white guys are making in Washington, D.C. or in engineering offices in St. Louis or whatever did influence so many people. But like I almost feel like these people are fascinating for their human struggles, but there are more human struggles. And like it's almost more this like cultural force of something in so many of certain kinds of people in America that just like wanted this river to be tameable. And like
Mhm.
someone, whether it was Eads or Humphreys, some white guy was going to be the guy doing that. And so it's like this train track that we got on that's been really hard to get off of.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing that stuck out to me because you tell these really beautiful, to me, beautiful stories of how a variety of different communities or cultures or peoples had lived with the river, right? And had kind of a mutual respect almost to understand like the river is not knowable and is certainly not tameable, right? And so kind of this, reciprocal relationship. But then, as you mentioned, these white guys, they come in and they're just ruining everything for a lot of different people throughout, different time periods. And, towards the end of the book, I was reading about, I think it was in Louisiana, where there were communities of folks who were kind of living, it seemed maybe not in harmony, but maybe harmony-ish. And then becomes like a taste for high fashion. And is it muskrats? Am I remembering that correct?
Muskrats, yes, that is
Muskrats.
correct.
And I was like, no, not the muskrats, because then what happens is, fight over pieces of, I guess, is swamp or marshland, and
Yeah.
then the complete, collapse of a community that seemed to be thriving, or at least seemed to be, doing pretty well in community with one another. And so that really made me sad.
There's a lot of sadness in the history of the Mississippi River. Yeah, I mean, like, so there's like an alternate book that could be written that could be like this, not the story. Again, I was interested in tracking how it changed. So I had to talk about guys like Humphreys and Eads. There'd be a beautiful book that are the stories of the people that just lived out there. And I tried to get those in where I could. And so, yeah, that's down you're talking specifically about kind of Plaquemines Parish downstream of New Orleans at the very end of the river. It's very marshy. And it became, I mean, this is true everywhere in the river. This is true in Memphis. Like, because the river was so hard to control, its wettest areas became a place of refuge for people that like weren't allowed to go other places often.
Mhm.
And often the people, those cultures, I don't know, tend to have a more thoughtful relationship with the natural world, tended less like wanted to find ways to live amid it, rather than atop it, I guess. And
Mhm.
so yeah, there's sort of these Cajun families and other ethnicities living in the wetlands in Louisiana who were making their living. Muskrats became a very popular thing briefly. That was sort of the first push to when wealthier people were like, well, I should buy up this land and charge people to hunt the muskrats. But oil was coming anyways. Not long afterwards, they discovered oil, so it was another thing. But yeah, it's one of the things that's always fascinated me about the river. And I remember I canoed the whole river from St. Louis down and like in Memphis, striking under the bridge, seeing people living in tents there because it
Mhm.
remained, not that that is a safe place, a place that anyone should be living, but it still today remains this place that because it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, it put me a last chance refuge for people that don't have anywhere else to go.
Mhm. This idea of the river as a refuge definitely, pops up throughout the book. And it was in those moments when you're describing, again, those time periods in history and those communities where it gave me an opportunity to think about the river very differently. And I love that you do spend some time talking about a variety of different communities who have made the river, part of their home and their history and their lineage. And it really gave me the opportunity to think about the river as something very different, right? Than maybe what we think of as, again, whether growing up in Memphis or in some other place, right? You take it for granted. And so I love that your book gave me a glimpse into totally different worlds. I actually wrote that in one of the notes in the margin. I was like, wow, like this is a world I would never know existed, or a type of lifestyle that I would never even think about had it not been for reading your book.
That's great. I'd be curious what, like, as a Memphian, what was the idea you received of the river growing up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was more of, again, a space of very much like recreation for
Mm,
me. I mentioned Mud Island, and actually, right now in Memphis, there's a project underway to revitalize Mud Island and to create something new in that space, which I'm also really excited about. But for me as a Memphian, it was always thinking about the river as recreation. There used to be like these big, I guess, paddle boats. That's what I was looking for. Paddle
mhm.
boats, kind of replicas of paddle boats. And I remember that. And, you could go on those and have like dinner cruise or whatever. And so recreation was a big piece. And then oftentimes when there were storms, or the threat of potential flooding, then for me, the message was always like, we have these great big bluffs. We'll always be protected
Interesting.
from some sort of big weather occurrence like that, which I think true, not true. I don't know. After reading your book, I'm like, I don't know how true that would be, forever, right? And as I
Right.
mentioned, even back in 2010, when all of that torrential rain came, then we saw flooding in nearby Millington, Tennessee, just a little bit northwards of us. So again, just thinking about some of the ways that maybe I thought about the river growing up is just kind of like, oh, it's cool. It's part, it's
Yeah,
kind of just part of our city and our story. Now thinking more expansively about, well, what parts of that story did I not learn, right?
that
Or
makes
what parts of
sense.
the story did I not even think to interrogate because I've just accepted, like, oh, the Mississippi River, place for transportation, barges, paddle boats, things like that. And so that was kind of the backdrop of the river when I was growing up.
That makes sense. And Mud Island, to come back to Mud Island, I think it's a fascinating place because I think I'm not going to get too much in the history because I'm going to botch it. I don't remember it specifically, but in itself, it was, I think there were some sort of like small scale black farmers out there. Like it has its own long tail of different uses, and it was a refuge itself. And then as sort of engineering came in to make the port area more controlled, it started to change. And so that Memphians that are interested in this kind of stuff, it's worth kind of looking at Mud Island and learning about that own history. Because I mean, one thing that strikes me every time I go to Memphis, it is one of the best cities on the river anywhere for like river access. The parks keep getting better and better. I love the Big Muddy Crossing, and so recreation. It's great to me that recreation is so possible there. But even in those spaces, they contain these other layers of history beneath them that are. It's always illuminating, I think, to like dig into the place where you live and understand it better.
Yeah, and that's what I think your book gives us the opportunity as Memphians to do, and I imagine as folks who also might live along different points of the mighty Mississippi River to think kind of differently about your own history. And I love that, throughout our conversation, you've talked about how you didn't just want this story to be about all these, dead old white guys who are making these decisions about, levees or other engineering, but rather a very more nuanced and comprehensive story about the river itself. And for me, that really, shone through. And I appreciated that, particularly because as I was reading The Great River, it made me think of another book that I read called Food Power Politics.
Hmm.
And it's talking about the Mississippi the food story of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. And in it, I was just taking notes, which is also part of what excites me about reading a book like this is when you start diving into history, you see all the ways that things are intersecting, right? And so in that book, it was talking about Sunflower County. And I was like, wait a minute, when I'm reading your book and you're talking about, Sunflower River, and I'm like, okay, I feel like there's something here. And so just again, thinking about decisions that were made about the river and about floodplains were impacting decisions that folks were making, decades later as well. And so that was really exciting for me to think about, okay, how is this showing up, or what are the other pieces of this story around decision making with farming, with grants that are being given, with Black sharecroppers, for example. And so that made history come even more alive for me in
Yeah.
thinking about our story.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and that's one of the topics I wish I had more time to get into is sort of like the history of cooperative farming and amongst Black farmers in particular in the South, because it is, as I said earlier, to me, the story of the river has to be the story of the floodplain, and the story of the floodplain, very sadly, I think, has been a story of sort of consolidation of these farms getting bigger and bigger, owned by
Mhm.
fewer and fewer, wealthier and wealthier people. And that has so many ripple effects in terms of like justice of like who has the access to power and money and land, in terms of big farms are more likely to just grow soybeans that we're going to ship off to other countries or grind into weird chemicals. None of it's
Mhm.
food. Um, and I've been thinking lately about like what people often ask, what do we need to do in the future? What's the best future for the river? And the flood stuff, I'm like, I don't even, it's like complicated. I do know it's like we need to make more room for water where we can, but that's very hard because you have to make hard decisions. It means someone's land is going to have to be like, well, it's not your land anymore. It's a space that sometimes
Mhm.
gets flooded. And the way we've done things in the past, it's not very promising how, I think it's unfortunately clear whose land we decide to flood. But the future of the floodplain is clear to me of like, we need more of that kind of cooperative Black farming that it has such a strong history in the Delta. And I think in some ways it's starting to happen. People are realizing they can make more money growing, sweet potatoes or peanuts or things that we actually eat. And often Black farmers in the floodplain are the leaders in that. So
Yeah, I love that. When you're thinking about that question of like, what should we do? What struck me as I was reading your book, because that's a question that you also ask some of the people in the book, kind of more contemporarily, like, what are their ideas about the decisions that should be made? And what really struck me about that was because the river is just like one kind of big organism, whatever decision you make, if we're thinking about just kind of in Memphis where the Mississippi River is going to have impacts both upstream and downstream. And oftentimes it seems like people weren't thinking about like, okay, what's going to happen if we make this decision to make whether these levees or to change the route of the river in this, in this area, how is that going to impact something that's, happening, a few states away or a few hundred, miles away from this particular area. And I'm just really curious to what you think about if there's, what decisions should be made. Is there even an answer? I don't think there is a singular answer, but how can we think about like I guess the most good or in terms of the river
yeah,
and in terms of the people?
yeah, these are all very good, very difficult questions. I'm going to start. I mean, like one of the things that as you were asking that, I was kind of jotting down one thing that this river or this book made me think about is scale and like how big this river is. And I think one of the really interesting things is indigenous people generally gave names to not like nobody thousands of years ago was naming the full Mississippi River. They would just have names for like this little bend, and it would be often about food they might harvest there or something that happened there. And so yeah, the ability for us to conceive of the Mississippi River as one big interconnected system is like it's scientifically important to think about that because changes in one place in the watershed, right? If you put a parking lot anywhere in this million square mile watershed, you're changing the river. You're making water flow more faster into rivers. You could potentially be increasing flooding. Um, but it's yeah, like it's important for us to understand that scientifically, but it's almost like this hubris of like we are able to do too much, and the fact that we
Mhm.
can now politically conceive of the Mississippi River as one entity I don't know. We just have we can think of it that way, but we haven't built structures that can do this. And that's one of the challenges of thinking forward in the future. Even right, I said the Army Corps of Engineers is like in charge of the engineering, but the National Park Service controls parts of the river. The U.S. Reclamation Bureau is out on the Missouri. There's so many federal agencies involved. There's so many state agencies involved. There's so many states in the watershed that we don't really have a system of governance that can work to do this. And we see this with some of the problems like pollution coming off farms in Iowa and other heartland states causing a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. It's been happening for years and nobody's quite figured out, how do we put structures in place to control this, because it spans so many different organizations and entities and scales of government.
Mm-hmm. Again, I'm just reminded of the different approaches or different belief systems, worldviews that folks throughout kind of the time period of the history that you share with us in the Great River, but also even contemporarily, like the different perspectives or beliefs that people are bringing to the river and how that's shaping the choices that are made. Thinking about those values, not just how do we value nature, but also how do we value or who do we value in terms of, like you mentioned, whose farmlands or, which communities are going to be impacted. And towards the end of the book, you talk about some of these different communities that contemporarily are impacted by, by the river, by, again, some of the different hazards, and how choices are being made or who's being valued in terms of, okay, you should move, or no, you should stay, or, what those choices are as well. And so it seems so complicated, but so important to really think about, like our relationship to the river as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think my hope as we're making these decisions, I mean, like one of the conflicts that I get into in the epilogue, and the whole last section of the book it's kind of a series of conflicts of like, we've done all this stuff and now we face these hard decisions. And so there's a project called the Yazoo Pumps that's down in the Mississippi Delta. And it's sort of like the last, we set this plan called the Mississippi Rivers and Tributaries Project back in 1941. And that was like, okay, we had a really bad flood in 27 and we're really going to get this in control. And so now it's been 80 years, 80 plus years, and it's not done. We never built the Yazoo Pumps, which were part of this project. But they have become really politically contentious. They have been for years. It's sort of been three different presidents have intervened either to like kill this project or to bring it back online. And now it's kind of starting to happen. Like there's discussions about it again, but also in a way that I didn't see in the history as clearly there. I mean, the complaint there is basically people realizing, oh, we build these pumps, they're going to get water off farmland that has been caused by engineering, but that's really good for, the small handful of farmers that own a lot of land. It's a very impoverished region that is majority Black, and the pumps will help a few of those people, but it won't change their life prospects substantially. And there finally is some notice of like, oh, like if we're going to be pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into this very rural, very struggling region, perhaps we should think about making sure that money, like the benefits of that money spreads a little bit more equitably. But it's just there. It's not, the systems we built aren't set up for that, right? It's very clear, like, well, we have ways that money can flow so that we can build flood control infrastructure. We don't have ways that money can flow so that, poor Black farmers that have small pieces of land can just receive money to make up for sort of the history that got them in that place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that you included that in the book as well, because I think, again, it's important for us to understand the river, maybe not just as a site of some lovely childhood memories or even of recreation, but to really understand what this river means to so many people, to actual communities, not just our economy, but thinking about like on the ground, what are these decisions? How are they impacting both the people, but then even our future? And I think you do a really great job of raising some questions, very complicated, complex questions, but questions that, we have to be thinking about if, for our future. So thank you so much for that. I'm wondering for folks who maybe they're like, okay, the Mississippi River, I haven't really thought about it, but it seems like there's so much going on. Are there any recommendations that you have in terms of like places that you really have enjoyed, just enjoyed the river? Because I know in the book you also talk about all the different travels that you've had as well in different spaces and places along the river. So I'm wondering if you could share with us some of maybe your favorite places to experience the river.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm gonna start. Y'all are lucky in Memphis. You have so like, from Mud Island down, you can just kind of the amount of public access on the river, the ways you can access it are incredible. So if someone's listening to this and they aren't going to Tomley Park or Mud Island or like going across the bridge and exploring the Arkansas side, just start with that. That's pretty great. Um, Beyond that, I mean, the I'll do a little plug. I don't know when this is airing, but if it's airing in time, I have a reading in Memphis June 25th, and then the next morning I'm driving down to Clarksdale, Mississippi, and meeting up with my friend John Resky, who kind of got me into this whole mess years ago when I profiled him, and we're going to canoe basically from Clarksdale to Rosedale. But the stretch below Memphis on the river is, I think, the most beautiful part of the river in many ways. There's after the bridges at Memphis, there's another bridge at Greenville, and then there's not a bridge until Vicksburg, Mississippi, and that's hundreds of miles. You might see some barges, but that's kind of you'll see some grain silos, but it's just an incredibly wild feeling place. It's not easy to get to. You want to hire someone like John. John's got a partner named Matt Burdine who's based in Memphis. That's another great choice for people to get out. Or like I said, this thing that we're doing June 26th to 28th. It's a ticketed thing. I think there's a few seats left in the canoe. So if you want to get out and touch and feel the river, that would be a good way to do it.
Yeah, I love that. Because, sometimes we think about nature as like very abstract. And so I think oftentimes folks, it's kind of weird, but people sometimes need an invitation to actually enjoy the nature that is right there. And as you mentioned, at least for now in Memphis, exploring that nature is free, right? You can just get
Right.
outside and really even just sit by the river or, walk over the bridge and really just take it all in. And I think there's something very restorative about being, near the water and just having that moment to really kind of like take in this very magnificent thing that cannot be tamed or controlled
Right.
despite the many attempts throughout history to do so.
Yeah. And just like sit on that riverbank and think about where the water's come from, where it's going. That's been the other thing that has really moved me. I remember not long after I did this long canoe trip in 2017, I wound up in Colorado for a wedding and went hiking with a friend. And we were hiking down this mountain outside of Boulder, and there was sort of like a little creek at our feet. Was just like it had snowed for the first time, and that snow is now melting because it had gotten warm. And I was like, wait, this water. I like looked at the map, and I was like, this water's going to go into the Arkansas River. It's going to come all the way down. It's going to enter the Mississippi, basically in Rosedale, which is, as close to that's my riverbank. It was close to where I lived then. And I felt very at home to like be like, okay, I'm flying home tomorrow. The water's going to follow me. It's going to take it, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 days. I don't know, but it's following after me. And that's why I love river towns like Memphis, is being able to sit there and realize how connected you are with so much.
Yeah, I love that. And that was something that really was driven home from your book as well, how interconnected everything is, not just thinking about currently, today, how we're all connected to these various points, but also throughout history. And so it gave me an opportunity again to rethink, honestly, for me to rethink time um,
Mm,
particularly in, some of the ways that you talked about different cultures thought about the river or had different kind of like origin stories about the creation of the universe. But then also just thinking about, again, those decisions, like if we put a levee here, how is that going to impact something upstream, downstream? How is that changing even the future of where the river might go? And so it gave me a moment to really reflect on this concept of time as well.
that's very cool. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, because it was. I mean, I guess it did for me too, particularly like the earthworks that you mentioned earlier. Um, they're these like astounding complexes that were built by indigenous people over thousands of years, and often they'd work on one site for one group of people would work on a site for centuries, and then it would be abandoned for reasons that we can't entirely know. And then a long period of time would pass, and no cultures was quite building anything like that. And then 1,000 years later, it would kind of reemerge. New people would build something quite similar in another place, clearly indebted to these past things. And that time scale, right? Like the United States of America is what, 250 years old? Are we that far? Yeah, I don't even, we can't do the math that fast. But these individual earthwork sites were built over longer periods of time than that. And then like to be able to think on millennial timescales, the Army Corps of Engineers, when they do projections about their engineering, they look forward 50 years, right?
Mhm.
People building these earthworks seem to be looking forward millennia. And I aspire to live in a world where we're all looking forward millennia and saying, what are we going to do now that will be good for our descendants thousands of years from now?
I love that idea of thinking about, yeah, a longer time scale and considering the interconnectedness of, not just our generation or even a couple generations, but generations after generations after generations. And your book is definitely an invitation for us to do that. Well, Boyce, it has been such a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you so much for telling this beautiful story about, our river. It has been such a joy to read it and to be with you today.
Thank you so much, son.
Thank you again to Boyce Upholt for joining us today. He is the author of The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. I want to leave you with a short excerpt from the book. Towards the end, he writes, "The river is an unappeasable God, and to react to it with fear and awe is not wrong. Perhaps what people learn after thousands of years of living along one of the world's great rivers is that change is inevitable, that chaos will come, that the only way to survive is to take care of yourself and of everyone else, human and beyond." When I tell you I learned so much about not just the Mississippi River itself, but also our own history here in the Mississippi Delta, in Memphis, in the United States, and especially just thinking about our own relationship, not just with the water, but also with the natural world as well. As Boyce and I were chatting, there are a lot of very complex questions that he kind of ends the book with, very complicated conversations that need to be had in order to think about, the future that we want to create, the types of world that we want to live in. And so I highly recommend The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. And as I mentioned, it made me think about some other books that we've read, some other guests that we've had. So, of course, I'm thinking about Bobby J. Smith, his book, Food, Power, Politics. I was also thinking about Ben Goldfarb, Crossings. And so I'm definitely think those are a trio of books that would really complement each other really well. And maybe we'll have to return to those conversations also. Well, this has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM Memphis. I am here every week having curious conversations with folks who know a lot about a lot. I am hoping that you're learning as much as I am and enjoying it as much as I am as well. Make sure that you subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format so you never miss a conversation. So also you can share it with a friend and maybe have a chat about some of the really great things that you have been learning. I cannot wait to be back with you next week.